The cold of the hangar seeped through Seth's thin janitorial jacket, a familiar chill that had become a part of his life. But tonight, the cold was sharper, laced with the tension of two grounded pilots and the furious glare of his boss, Mr. Hartman. He shouldn't have been there. His job was to mop floors and empty bins, to remain invisible. Yet here he stood, under the gleaming white wing of a Gulfstream G650, the private jet of Evelyn Reed, CEO of Reed Technologies. A woman he'd only ever seen from a distance, a blur of tailored suits and determined strides. The jet's engines were silent, stubbornly refusing to start, and a multi-million-dollar deal in Zurich hung in the balance. Why, after her own expert mechanics had failed, had she turned to the men who cleaned their break-room toilets? Hartman's voice was a venomous whisper. "You have 5 minutes to explain why you're not holding a mop, Peterson. Ms. Reed's request is insane, and I won't have a janitor touching her aircraft." Seth's gaze remained fixed on the engine cowling. He could feel its stillness, the subtle wrongness of it. His hands, calloused from bleach and brooms, twitched with an old, forgotten muscle memory. He ignored Hartman, his voice quiet but clear, directed only at the woman standing by the cockpit door. "You said the fuel pumps are priming, but the ignition sequence fails." Evelyn Reed stepped forward, her expression unreadable. The pilots exchanged skeptical glances. She simply nodded, her gaze piercing. "That's correct. They've checked everything. The computer shows no errors." Seth took a hesitant step closer, the scent of jet fuel a ghost from another life. A life before the worn-out uniform, before the constant ache of exhaustion, before he was just Rosie's dad, the quiet man from apartment 3B. He was a ghost in this world of power and flight, a world that had once been his. But she had asked for him, and in her eyes, he saw not a CEO looking at a janitor, but a person desperate for a solution, willing to take a chance on a whisper of a memory. The memory was from 3 weeks prior. He had been polishing the glass of the executive lounge that overlooked the tarmac, his movements slow and methodical. Evelyn Reed had been inside, staring out at the same jet, her posture rigid with a grief he recognized. He hadn't meant to speak, but the words slipped out. "It's a beautiful machine. The twin Rolls-Royce engines, they have a unique hum when they're perfectly tuned." A sound like a promise. She had turned, startled, her guard momentarily down. "You know about engines?" He'd simply nodded, embarrassed by his outburst. "I used to." A long time ago, he'd quickly returned to his work, but he felt her watching him. Now, in the present, that single moment was his only credential. He ran a hand over the smooth, cold metal of the engine access panel. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Evelyn gave a sharp nod to her pilot, who reluctantly unlatched the panel. Hartman sputtered, "This is a violation of every protocol. Your job is on the line, Peterson." Ignoring him, Seth leaned in. The complex heart of the machine was laid bare, a tangle of wires, pipes, and precision engineering that made his own heart ache with longing. He didn't need diagnostic tools. He used his senses, honed over a decade of working on these very engines. He sniffed the air. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of unburnt fuel. His fingers, surprisingly nimble, traced a fuel line, feeling for vibrations that weren't there. He found it in less than a minute. A small, secondary fuel filter, tucked away behind a hydraulic reservoir, easily missed in a standard computer diagnostic. It was clogged. A simple, mundane problem, the kind that computers, for all their genius, often overlooked. He pointed. "There. The bypass filter for the ignition injector. It's blocked." The head pilot, a man with 20 years of experience, leaned in, his eyes widening in disbelief. He tapped the housing. "I'll be damned." 5 minutes later, with the filter cleared, the engine roared to life with a perfect, soul-shaking hum. The sound of a promise fulfilled. Evelyn Reed's shoulders, which had been tense enough to snap, finally relaxed. As the ground crew prepared for immediate departure, she approached Seth, pulling a thick envelope from her briefcase. "I don't know how to thank you. Please, take this." Inside was a stack of cash that could have paid his rent for a year. Seth gently pushed her hand away. "No, thank you, Ms. Reed. Just, if you could tell Mr. Hartman it was on your authority, and maybe approve my overtime slip, that's all." Evelyn stared at him, baffled. In her world, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something more. "That's it. You just saved me a deal worth more than this entire hangar. Seth looked down at his worn boots, a faint smile touching his lips. I didn't do it for the money. I missed the work. He thought of his daughter, Rosie, asleep in their small apartment, her backpack ready by the door for school. He thought of the drawing she'd tucked into his lunchbox that morning, a smiling stick figure labeled Daddy, holding hands with a smaller one labeled Me. That was his currency. I have to get home to my daughter, he said softly. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. Evelyn saw it then, the deep, unshakable integrity in his tired eyes. She saw a man who had lost almost everything but had held onto the one thing that mattered. She pocketed the envelope, a new, more complex plan already forming in her mind. Of course. Thank you, Seth, using his first name felt like crossing a threshold. The next day was brutal. Hartman, humiliated that a janitor had succeeded where experts failed, was out for blood. He cornered Seth by the slop sink. You think you're some kind of hero, Peterson, he sneered, his face blotchy with rage. You're a janitor. You broke every rule in the book. You're a liability. He slapped a formal disciplinary warning onto the wet counter. This is your first and final warning. One more toe out of line, one more fantasy about being a mechanic, and you're gone. You'll be lucky to find a job cleaning gutters. The threat landed like a punch to the gut. This job, as demeaning as it often was the fragile thread holding his life together. It was Rosie's school lunches, the roof over her head, the second-hand coat that kept her warm. Fear, cold and metallic, filled his throat. He spent the rest of the day in a haze of anxiety, scrubbing floors with a frantic energy, trying to make himself smaller, more invisible than ever. That evening, he tried to hide his worry from Rosie as they ate dinner, macaroni and cheese from a box. But she saw it. His 7-year-old daughter, with her wide, knowing eyes, saw everything. Are you sad, Daddy? She asked, pushing a piece of macaroni onto her fork. He forced a smile. Just tired, sweet pea. Long day. She slid off her chair, came around the small table, and wrapped her arms around his neck. It's okay, she whispered into his ear, her small voice a balm on his frayed nerves. You're the best daddy in the whole world. He held her tight, the warmth of her small body a shield against the cold fear. He was terrified of failing her. The warning slip felt like a ticking bomb in his locker, a countdown to losing it all. Evelyn returned 2 days later, the Zurich deal successfully closed. The first thing she did was not meet with her board, but seek out the hangar's lead mechanic. From him, she learned about Hartman's vindictive write-up and the threat against Seth's job. A quiet fury built within her. She found Seth in the deserted employee break room, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee, the weight of the world on his slumped shoulders. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched around his eyes. She approached quietly, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum. I heard what Hartman did, she said, her voice gentle. I am so sorry. I never intended for my request to put you in this position. Seth looked up, surprised. He expected anger, or at the very least, corporate distance. He didn't expect an apology. It's not your fault, Ms. Reed. It is, she insisted, sitting in the worn plastic chair opposite him. I used your skill without considering the consequences for you. That was selfish. The formal barrier between them seemed to dissolve in the sterile room. She spoke of the pressure she was under, the legacy of her father, a pilot himself who had loved the jet, and the board members who saw her as too young, too female, too soft. In turn, Seth found himself opening up, telling her about his life as a certified aviation engineer, the wife he had lost to a sudden illness, and the cascade of grief and financial ruin that followed, forcing him into this life just to stay afloat and care for Rosie. He wasn't just a janitor, he was a man hollowed out by loss, rebuilding his world one mopped floor at a time. She listened, her gaze never wavering, and for the first time in years, Seth felt seen. Not pitied, but truly seen. Hartman, meanwhile, felt his power solidify. He believed Evelyn Reed's silence was tacit approval of his authority. He decided to make a public spectacle of firing Seth, a definitive statement to anyone else who might step out of their designated role. He called a mandatory all-hands meeting in the main hangar bay, right in front of the gleaming Gulfstream. The entire staff, mechanics, ground crew, administrative assistants, and other janitors, was assembled. Seth was called to the front, his heart pounding against his ribs. He stood there, in his faded blue uniform, feeling the weight of dozens of pitying or scornful eyes. As you all know, this company prioritizes safety and protocol above all else, Hartman began, his voice booming with self-importance. We cannot have untrained personnel performing unauthorized work on multi-million-dollar aircraft. It is a gross violation, a danger to our clients and our reputation. He held up the disciplinary form. Seth Peterson, despite his role as a member of the custodial staff, took it upon himself to tamper with Ms. Reed's aircraft. This reckless act, regardless of the outcome, is grounds for immediate termination. He paused for dramatic effect, a cruel smirk on his face. Therefore, effective immediately, Mr. Peterson's employment is about to be the least of your concerns. Mr. Hartman, the voice, sharp and cold as ice, cut through the hangar. All heads turned. Evelyn Reed stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed, her expression flinty. She walked slowly toward the front, her presence silencing the entire room. The air crackled with a new, dangerous energy. Hartman's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion and alarm. Seth's breath caught in his throat. He had expected to be fired and shamed, but he had not expected a savior. Evelyn stopped directly in front of Hartman, her eyes locking onto his. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her voice dangerously low and carrying to every corner of the hangar. "Mr. Peterson was not tampering with my aircraft. He was acting on my direct and explicit order." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Hartman paled. But the protocols, the liability," he stammered. "The liability," Evelyn cut him off, "was a grounded jet and a 9-figure deal on the verge of collapse because your so-called experts were stumped. Mr. Peterson, with his untrained eyes, solved the problem in under 5 minutes." She took another step closer, and Hartman instinctively recoiled. "It's funny you bring up protocols, Mr. Hartman. Because I had my team pull your management reports. I found a dozen formal complaints of bullying filed against you over the past 2 years. I found evidence of you falsifying overtime sheets to shortchange employees. And I found that you, personally, signed off on the maintenance inspection that missed the clogged filter on my father's jet 3 weeks ago." The blood drained from Hartman's face. He was exposed, his petty tyranny laid bare for all to see. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The man who had wielded his minimal power like a weapon was now utterly powerless. Evelyn's voice was devoid of all emotion. "You're the liability, Mr. Hartman. You cultivate a culture of fear, not excellence. You judge people by their uniforms, not their abilities. And you are a danger to my company and its values." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quiet finality of her words was devastating. Seth stood frozen, watching the men who had tormented him completely unravel. It wasn't just a defense, it was a demolition. "Security will escort you off the premises. Your termination is effective immediately," Evelyn stated, turning her back on the shell-shocked Hartman as 2 guards moved forward. The crowd was silent, stunned. Evelyn then turned to face Seth. The entire hangar staff watched as the powerful CEO stood before the humble janitor. The anger in her eyes softened, replaced by a profound respect. "Seth," she said, her voice now warm and clear. "I believe a position has just opened up." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the mechanics. "But I have something different in mind for you. I'm creating a new role. Head of Engineering and Restoration for my personal fleet, starting with the complete overhaul and modernization of this G650. It was my father's, and I want it treated by someone who understands not just its mechanics, but its soul." She named a salary that made Seth's head spin, a figure that was more than he had made in his best year as an engineer. It was not just a job, it was a lifeline. It was a restoration of his dignity, his passion, and his future. Seth was speechless. His mind, which seconds ago had been bracing for homelessness, couldn't process the sudden reversal. His hand went instinctively to his breast pocket, feeling the crinkle of the crayon drawing Rosie had made for him. A smiling stick-figure dad. He looked at Evelyn, at the sea of faces now looking at him with newfound respect, and finally, he found his voice. A single, choked word. "Yes." A wave of spontaneous applause broke out among the crew, a genuine celebration of the underdog's victory. Seth felt tears welling in his eyes for the first time in years, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, unbelievable gratitude. 6 months later, the hangar was transformed. Seth, now in a crisp, dark blue engineering polo with Reed Fleet Management embroidered over the pocket, moved with a confidence he thought he had lost forever. He was no longer a ghost, he was a leader. His team of mechanics respected him not just for his title, but for his deep knowledge and his quiet, steady hand. The Gulfstream, his first project, gleamed under the lights, its engines purring with a perfection he had personally overseen. It was more than a machine to him now, it was a symbol of his own restoration. Evelyn visited the hangar often, but her visits were different. She no longer came as a CEO inspecting an asset. She came as a friend, bringing coffee, asking about his day. The formal barrier was gone completely, replaced by an easy camaraderie. One sunny Saturday afternoon, she arrived to find not just Seth, but a small girl with bright, curious eyes and a missing front tooth, who was carefully drawing airplanes in a notebook at a workbench. "You must be Rosie," Evelyn said, her smile genuine and warm. Rosie looked up, unafraid. She had heard all about the nice lady who gave her daddy his old job back. She scrambled off the stool, ran over, and wrapped her arms around Evelyn's legs in an unprompted, heartfelt hug. Then, she held up her notebook. On the page was a new drawing, a big airplane, with 3 smiling stick figures beside it. She pointed to them one by one. "Daddy, you, and me." Evelyn felt a surprising warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with corporate success or closing a deal. She knelt down, looking at the drawing. "It's the most beautiful drawing I've ever seen," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Later that evening, after Rosie had been picked up by a neighbor for a sleepover, Seth and Evelyn stood on the quiet tarmac, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool, filled with the scent of distant rain and the faint, comforting smell of jet fuel. "Thank you," Seth said, breaking the comfortable silence. He looked at her, his expression full of a gratitude that words couldn't capture. "Not just for the job. For seeing me. When I felt like I was invisible," Evelyn leaned against the railing, her gaze on the horizon. "You were never invisible, Seth. You were just quiet. You reminded me of my father. He always said you can judge a person's character by how they treat things they don't have to, a piece of machinery, a stranger, a promise." She turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "You fixed more than just my jet that night. You reminded me what this was all about. It's not about the deals or the bottom line. It's about passion. Integrity." The vast, empty space that grief had carved into both their lives felt smaller in that moment. It was being filled, slowly but surely, by the framework of a new, unexpected family. A family built not on blood or obligation, but on shared respect, quiet strength, and the courage to take a chance on a person everyone else had overlooked. And one has to wonder, how many lives could be changed if we all learned to look past the uniform and see the person wearing it? How many hidden geniuses are sweeping floors, waiting for someone to see the spark of passion in their eyes? Sometimes, the people with the power to fix the most broken things are not the ones in charge, but the ones with the quietest hands and the biggest hearts.